Well, everyone, thank you for coming. This will be a very interesting, I think, presentation because I will try to fit in two presentations into one time slot. The second one is by a guy I never met, but I want to stand in for him because he didn't get a visa, because he didn't ask. And that is, a very good way not to get a visa to Serbia if you don't ask, but you need it. So I will try to squeeze in both lectures at once. After my slides, I will have his, and I will try to do it as good as I believe he would have done it if he was actually here. I'm doing it out of respect to his long, useless flight from Taiwan to Serbia or whatever. So today I wanted to talk to you about how web3 changed open source. And considering this, room is the size that it is, and it's not like there is a million of us here, we can always have chats about certain concepts. I'll try to make pauses. If someone wants to ask something, just start waving your hands, and we can discuss it, even if even as I go along. You don't really have to wait for me to finish in order to ask questions. The same thing about his presentation that I know not a lot about, but will try to do my best there too. So myself, this is me. I'm a washed up engineer. I built software for life, then I built companies for life. Now I don't really know what I'm actually doing. So, considering that, I'm very happy that a lot of you came here today. It's actually more than I expected. I expected when I saw it's community stage, I thought that the turnout is going to be like it actually was in 9:30. So what I wanted to talk to you about is how open source is changed by Web3, and did it even exist to begin with, which I think is maybe even a more important question here. How many of you know about this article by Eric Raymond, Cathedral versus Bazaar? Yeah. So not too many people, this is for older guys like myself. This is actually one of the first things that I read back when I was young, when it comes to ideas behind software engineering. I think the main thing is ideas behind, this is not something that you are reading, to learn how to code or how to become an actual engineer or whatever. This is something you are reading to understand the philosophical and social differences between different types of companies, maybe a different ways of building software. And this is the time, when we used to pirate stuff here in Serbia, but I mean a lot more than we do today. And this work by Eric Raymond actually explained how centralized corporations that we hated at that time, like Microsoft, built software compared to the new movement that was happening, which was open source. And he basically compared these centralized companies that dealt with long release cycles and with centralized planning and waterfall and everything. He compared them to a cathedral where there is a dogma around how are you doing things. He compared them to a bazaar where you basically just come in and start selling stuff. And basically that was his understanding of what open source is compared to what proprietary software is. And if you look at these things, in terms of structures, in terms of how do people actually collaborate, etc. These things were actually very different. But if you look at it from today's standpoint, maybe not a lot of people talk about Cathedral versus Bazaar, but we do talk about proprietary versus open source in relatively the same manner. And what I would argue is that this is actually not true. Maybe it was true in 1995. It's definitely not true today. When we look at the way that the corporations are building software, it is the same thing as open source is doing it. There are a lot of tools that were created in the open source movement, both from the actual tool standpoint and from the standpoint of the philosophy behind the tool. And open source brought a lot of these things into corporations. When you look at pull requests, they came from the open source world. But how many companies do you know that actually have more than 2 engineers that are building a proprietary software that do not use something like Git or another versioning system, and who do not have pull requests? They do not exist. If you look at it from a methodology standpoint, there is nothing in corporations that is done today that is actually different than the approach of building open source. The problem with open source, on the other hand, is that the only way for you to monetize open source for a long time has been to actually open a company. So from that standpoint, we can also say that the open source also changed in a lot of ways, and there is no real open source when it comes to the way how are you developing software. The main thing that we have actually between proprietary software and open source software is that proprietary software has a pretty bad concept of security by obscurity, in terms of your software is secure because no one knows what the source code is actually doing, which we can argue that it's just bad security practice in general. And the second thing that we have, in closed source software development is that the software itself is a moat, and it becomes much harder for someone to copy you because they have a lot more to do in order to copy you than just to adhere by a certain license that you chose. So when we are looking at this, it's pretty much blended in. There is a difference between security models in terms of your access to the actual source code, and there is a difference in different business models behind them. But these business models are not really that much different in open source world than in proprietary software world. So I would say that from this perspective, proprietary and open source software are pretty much the same thing today in many ways. Outside, at least from the spectrum standpoint, there is no Cold War between proprietary and open source anymore. There is no East and West. Everything is pretty much blended in with a couple of different flavors. And we learned this in many cases in a kind of a hard way. When you're looking at open source software, there are 4 usual ways how do you actually discuss open source and how it is actually monetized. And of course, like everything, people decided to categorize and standardize them. And we started, usually in open source with professional services. Professional services are a good way to go. You have no moat on professional services, basically just your brand. If you are a big contributor to an open source project, maybe people will pay you more or hire you more often. But at the end of the day, you are limited by man hours in this case. And this is why, open source was looking for other ways to monetize. And the first things that happened were hosting solutions. Pretty much maybe you didn't want to deal with the infrastructure, so you just want to outsource the dealing with the infrastructure to someone else, you're going to pay money for that, and that becomes a part of that open source project. In both cases, professional services or in hosted solutions, you are paying either a freelancer and a contractor, or you are paying a company, So in that way, there is no open source without companies or, trusted individuals. And these 2 models proved to be relatively scalable. The main thing there is relatively, it was hard to defend against hosted solutions because it's easy to learn how to host something. And it's also not if it's someone else's software, everyone can basically learn how to build stuff on top of it. So they were hard to defend, had no moat, and they were relatively scalable. So open source turned to open core with projects like Red Hat, etc. mainly. And what happened was that we started having software that has paid components. There are a couple of people here that worked with me when we were trying to do a proof of concept, proof of value project for Polygon, before it was even merged with Matic. And we tried to basically fork one interesting DEX that was called and is still called Loopring, and we tried to do a friendly fork of Loopring, and we basically wanted to show that Polygon compared to Ethereum works much faster, and that you can run the same software on it. And this is another point that I have there. You know, these guys basically told us it's free for you, of course, to fork Loopring. We can get to know each other. This is very nice. If you want to use Loopring, though, you should maybe think about buying our order book. And order book was like maybe 100 or 200K. I don't remember anymore. So we said, let's just build another order book and put it in and see what happens. We just need to use the same order book on Ethereum and on Polygon and, show people that this can be done. And what happened was that we soon realized that a big parts of the pretty much core Loopring code are actually in the paid proprietary order book. So you cannot actually run Loopring with another order book or understand what it actually does unless you have the order book. And I actually wrote to the guy, who is the CEO of Loopring, and told him that, can we do something about this? And this really seems like a weird approach, in building open source projects. And he told me that it's not, that this is completely normal and that I'm crazy. He got a bit mad. And considering I currently believe, and this lecture shows that open source doesn't really actually exist, I think he was actually right. So, sorry for him, for, blaming him for that thing that he did. But I would say at the end of the day that this is what I'm talking about when we are talking about these blended solutions between proprietary and open source. Because at the end of the day, all of the projects, because they have to have a centralized company behind them, and that company has to pay people, and they have to do things, they need to have a business model. And if they have a business model, that business model needs to become defensible. And if your code is a part of making that project defensible, then you are probably going to try and do it. At the end of the day, open core projects pretty much usually are trying to give you additional tools that you can pay for. But at the end of the day, both hosting projects and open core projects are also trying to use code in some way to defend the core project and to make you pay for it in some way. So at the end of the day, there really is no free beer or free lunch. We are talking about mainly projects that are just trying to monetize in the best way possible. And proprietary has this also. When you look at the way, that open source, open core, and proprietary software are monetized, we can really see that the proprietary followed open source in this path. Proprietary saw what open source is doing. They said, well, we are already not giving you any code for free, so we are going to look at freemium models. We are going to look at free trial models. We are going to get you hooked in other ways, because that's what you are doing at this position. You are trying to, with open core, with marketplaces, with hosting, you are using the free version of the product to hook someone in order to get into your system and to start paying for something else later, and the company that is going to benefit from that is the company that is charging the service. And then came Bitcoin and Ethereum, and others too, but I would say that these were the first two projects that showed the open source world that there is suddenly a fifth way for you to monetize open source, and this is through tokens. Suddenly, these are the first projects, and the other projects that came after them, at least the legit ones. These are the first projects that showed that you can actually accumulate and accrue value and get value to the open source contributors just by building the software, not by creating a company behind it. Sure, some people created companies. Sure, there is Ethereum Foundation, but at the end of the day, Ethereum Foundation is a foundation, and you can get money, based on based on what you are doing for the Ethereum community without directly benefiting a singular company in any way or getting paid by a singular company. Just if you are an Ethereum holder, you are already a part of this journey in some way, because you know, whatever is built on Ethereum is supposedly supposed to increase the value of Ethereum itself, and at the end of the day, we are going in that direction, that smart contract platforms and other types of blockchain platforms are basically showing that they're currently probably the best way for us to build the next version of the internet. This is of course arguable, you know, it's possible we are going to figure out a better way to have a fault-tolerant internet than blockchain, but that part didn't come yet. And this idea, you know, that was summed up in this fat protocol layer, thin application layer thesis, and driven by tokens, is what got us the type of Ethereum that we have today, with all its good sides and all its flaws. And when we are talking about our ability to build economy, to battle fake news, to basically play around with data in many ways going forward, this is probably the more superior way to do it. You know, I'm not just talking about, you know, is this better than banks or something like that. It's actually not important if it's better than banks. The important thing here actually is that it is more integrated than banks. First time in history of building software, you can become a developer, you can create an open source project, monetize it through some type of token, and suddenly also have a built-in payment mechanism and payment processor in the core technology itself. You do not have to play around with using third-party services. And this is also going to solve global warming, you know, because we can create virtual worlds, we can have wars in virtual worlds, you know, you can we can create an infinite number of metaverses where every country can get to be USA. So, you know, from this standpoint, because we can create virtual content that is limitless, we can also expand limitless, and there is no point of us having any types of problems anymore. There are a lot of people that also, you know, were talking about in the last couple of years, especially when Bitcoin price went down, how Bitcoin spends the same amount of electricity as the country of Netherlands. I did a couple of lectures where I was talking about that. That maybe also means that we do not need Netherlands. I'm sorry, Netherlands. Maybe there are people here from there, but you know, I believe that we can have a virtual Netherlands on top of Ethereum. It's probably going to be just as good. If someone wants to do a proof of concept, I'm very willing to do that. So hopefully, you know, we keep Bitcoin and Ethereum, and Netherlands gets cancelled. That is the message I'm trying to send here. Considering that now we can have, you know, virtual worlds, we basically do not have to have real ones anymore, and it's probably going to become very expensive to live in the real world. So you know, hopefully, guys, you know, you can have fun in Belgrade while it lasts. I'm not really sure what that future is going to look like, but because it becomes much easier, you know, to build stuff in the digital world than in the actual world, you know, this is probably where the world is going. So Ready Player One movie might be our future anyway. And because we are living in these weird times, you know, I would say the main play in Web3 or after Web3 basically becomes, at the end of the day, who owns the data. Because when we look at what people are talking about, you know, personal security, today it is actually very funny, because the more technology that we have, the more ways we actually have for people to exploit that technology. Our previous company, Managed WP or Devana Technologies, was basically sold to GoDaddy in 2016. It was a very good thing, I think, for myself, for a couple of reasons. First reason is I got to work with some really, really smart people in GoDaddy who used to build the internet from the 80s and you know, up, even before World Wide Web. And these were some really great people that I could learn a lot from. The second thing was I got quite a bit of money for me back then, and I was really happy about that also. I would like to happen again. And the third thing I think was that when I was a part of GoDaddy, I realized something that was really interesting to me, and that is that GoDaddy spends, I think, 25 or 30 million dollars per year back then on a team of about 15 people running cybersecurity for GoDaddy in a very particular way. You know, this was not one of the teams that was trying to prevent attacks. They were just trying to analyze attacks. And they dealt with GoDaddy's security system log files that were around 1.3, 1.4 terabytes every month. And with a 25 to $30 million budget for software plus their salaries, they were able to actually go through around 1% of that data. So in about 99% of the cases, GoDaddy had zero idea what actually happened. It doesn't mean it was breached, it just means they didn't know. And from this perspective, this is a problem that we have with Fortune 500s today. This is why we have more and more cyber attacks, which is why the internet itself is becoming completely unstable in many ways, and we are defending it not by the core protocol. We are defending it by third-party tools, most of which are open source, in many cases developed and maintained by free people, and in many cases not monetized, because when you have free people, you do not have a company, and it's very hard for you to actually monetize something out of that. Web3 also has a number of problems there. You know, we have a very small amount of clients. We have a relatively small amount of core contributors and developers. I'm not saying that the current version of web3 is the solution, but if we are talking about the future and security of internet, then we need to realize that all tools on the internet need to become monetized in some way, that the internet itself needs to become monetized in other ways and not just in advertising. Well, it's not just, but you know, I would say mainly in advertising, and that we also need to have security and privacy and trust as part of the core protocol, and not as a third-party vendor solution in general. And this is what actually got me hooked to Web3. I always liked open source before I realized that it doesn't exist. And I also believed that Web3 today is doing for the internet what basically computer networks back then got with the internet. Fault-tolerant systems today are getting on top of the internet with Web3. And I think this is an interesting idea that we need to think about, and there is a big problem that we are actually lacking standards. And hopefully this changes in the future, because the main thing in the future is going to probably go into the direction where, because open source is already, I would say, the main way that we are building the internet. We have more and more corporations building open source solutions. We could even argue that all open source solutions are backed by some kind of a company outside of Web3 and the tokenized world, and there are also quite a lot of them there too. So the main, if we look at it from this perspective, you know, it used to be that we could have just read the data, and we paid the people to produce the data, and we paid for people to build the software, and we consumed it. And then we became a part of the process of creating the data ourselves with Web2, and the data was still owned at the end of the day by the platforms that we are creating it on. And if we are thinking about Web3 in this idea that it is very important who owns the data, and if we are looking at what is currently happening with AI, which is showing us that we are basically looking at the future of the internet that is not going to be driven by what type of software do we have. It's going to be driven by what type of data do we have the access to, and how much data can we actually process. If you look at OpenAI as a project, first of all, it's not open. You have to. I think it's really amazing, that you call a project open, and then the first thing you do is you say, in order to access this, you need to ask for permission. So permissioned AI is a great project. However, what permissioned AI is doing, it's basically taking the data that the platforms gave them, or that they stole from you, or whatever you want to call it, and they're basically packaging it for your use. The software itself that they have, or the actual LLM models, etc., they are not that new. Yes, they did some very innovative and new things, but the models themselves are 5+ years old. This is not, it's not like OpenAI had a huge breakthrough in many things. That they had some breakthroughs, but they didn't have huge breakthroughs in many things. They basically just threw more money and computer power and gave more access to data to ChatGPT and to their other platforms than anyone else did before. And from that standpoint, ownership of the data was actually the game changer for them. And this means that ownership of the data is the future of the internet for us. So if we actually want to own the data also, or we want not to have big corporations owning the data, then it suddenly becomes very important for us to have these protocols that actually enable that. And considering that finally we have tools that we can use to actually monetize projects that are actually open source and open in different ways than just having a company, because at the end of the day, when you create a company, you have to embrace a certain type of behavior. And from that standpoint, I believe that we are in a better position than ever to actually do something like this. And it's not so much about proprietary or open source, it's more about gated or open access to data, or your ability to choose who are you giving your data to. So from that standpoint, I believe we should be thinking about this new version of the Cathedral versus Bazaar. There was this old meme, back in the early 2000s, and it basically said on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. There is this meme, in blockchain world, that on the internet no one knows you're a fridge. It's going to be more and more important from many ways, because the problem that I just mentioned in terms of GoDaddy having in 2016, 2017, when I was there, this is the problem that we are going to have in one residential block of New Belgrade in 10 years or so, because the number of devices we have connected to the internet, which are internet users. You and me, we are not really internet users. The real internet users are the devices that we are connecting to the internet. And that number is going to grow exponentially. IoT and 5G and 6G, they are basically giving us more bandwidth to deal with data and to deal with software than ever, and to have more connected software than ever. And this is going to become a huge security risk going forward anyway. So considering that the internet itself is pretty much garbage right now, and it's relatively overrated, we probably need to be thinking about ways to solve it. And if you are asking me, the best way that we currently have going forward is to think about fault-tolerant systems as the backbone of this future internet. So can we skip to the next guy's presentation, so I do that too, and then we have questions. Oh, it's not this one. I can do this one too.
Unfortunately, we are going to proceed with the next lecture
okay.
in around 10 minutes. So
no slides for me. Okay.
Yeah, we can try to go like super quickly
it
and
will be
have
super
a little
quickly.
bit of fun.
I don't need slides. Yeah, it's okay. I don't need slides. So his presentation was about is it better to build, internet or so? The presentation was about the difference of building software slow versus moving fast. And the thing that I wanted to tell you there, it is much better to build quality, good software and secure software fast than it is to build very bad, unsecure software slowly. And whenever you have a chance to build it fast and good, always build it fast and good rather than slow and bad. It took me 22 years of software development to learn this. It is an important message. Yes. Yes, that is exactly true. It also took me 40 years of life to learn that too. Yes, yes. Alan Ford knew it, back in Yugoslavia, and we lost that knowledge. So it applies to software too. And always ask for a visa when coming from Serbia if you need a visa. Yes, unless if you don't, this will happen, and I will speak at the conference instead of you. Any questions?
Yeah.
Sounds good. In that case, I will be outside drinking rakia and drinking coffee and whatever I can get to drink, because I'm a borderline alcoholic at this point. And yes, I'm an open source alcoholic. So from that standpoint, thank you for being here. And if you want to chat about something, I will be outside drunk. Thank you.